So far we've discussed a couple of different diseases that cause hypertension due to dysregulation of the amount of aldosterone produced in the body. Now let's remind ourselves of the anatomy of the kidney for a second. So this whole unit here is called a nephron, the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, and begins over here in the renal artery where oxygenated blood flows to the kidney through the afferent arteriole. It gets filtered here in the glomerulus, and the part that gets through, the filtrate, will go through the proximal convoluted tubule, through the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and out in the form of urine through the collecting duct. Now the part we're concerned with today is the distal convoluted tubule. And the reason we care today about the distal convoluted tubule is that there are very important cells that live right next to the distal convoluted tubule on both sides. So they kind of surround the distal convoluted tubule. These are called juxtaglomerular cells. Juxtaglomerular cells. Let's take an example. Let's say you had a very well hydrated person. Well, then this person would have plenty of blood volume. They'd have plenty of blood volume flowing through the renal artery and plenty of blood flowing through the afferent arteriole and here in the glomerulus and being made into urine, passing through the nephron. There'd be plenty of urine flow through the distal convoluted tubule, and it would actually cause the walls of the distal convoluted tubule to stretch. And the juxtaglomerular cells that live right next to the distal convoluted tubule, they'd feel that stretch. And they'd say, we've sensed that this person has plenty of volume. You know what? Since that person has plenty of volume, so their volume is high, we can do nothing. We don't have to do anything because this person is perfectly fine. Now let's take the opposite example. Let's say you had a dehydrated person. Well, then this person would have very little blood volume and very little flow through the nephron, very little urine being made, very little urine passing through the distal convoluted tubule, and these walls, instead of stretching, they would sag. Now the juxtaglomerular cells would sense that sag. They would say, I know what that sag means. That means this person has low blood volume. And we need to do something about it. And what we're going to do about it is they're going to secrete the famous hormone called renin. And they would secrete renin, so there would be more renin. Now, as you may remember from previous videos, renin begins the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Now, the purpose of this system is to concentrate your urine. That means to hold on to as much water as possible to pee out very, very concentrated urine. The reason you want to do this is because you want to retain that water because you're worried you have low blood volume and you want to keep the water to, cycle back into your blood and keep your blood pressure up. So we've talked about the juxtaglomerular cell's response to a well-hydrated person, in which case it really just does nothing because it doesn't need to do anything, and the response to a dehydrated person that doesn't have enough volume, in the blood and in the urine. And the response to that is that you'll secrete renin in order to raise the blood pressure and retain water and concentrate your urine. Now let's take a third situation. Let's say you have a perfectly well-hydrated person with plenty of blood volume, but they happen to have a blockage in the renal artery, what we would call a renal artery stenosis. And this can be something that's inborn, congenital, or it can be something you develop later in life, maybe through atherosclerosis, etc. And this blockage is going to occlude some of the lumen of the renal artery. We would call this a renal artery stenosis. And it might look something like this. This is a MRI with contrast. So you have you've injected dye, contrast, into the person's blood vessels, so they all show up as white. So you've got plenty of white, that means blood flow. Plenty of blood flow here in the abdominal aorta, and actually plenty of blood flow here through the left renal artery. But there's a black spot here, which means that there's not blood flow, not as much as there should be, to the right renal artery. And this is how you'd pick up renal artery stenosis by MRI. Now let's think about this for a second. Let's say you have a blockage here in the renal artery stenosis. So the person has perfectly adequate blood volume in the rest of the body. It's just that right here, not as much blood flow can make it through this somewhat occluded lumen. So not as much blood is going to make it into the afferent arteriole, not as much blood is going to make it to the glomerulus, not as much urine is going to be created in the nephron. What effect is this going to have on the juxtaglomerular cells and on systemic blood pressure?